Welcome to Human Monsters. John Edward Robinson was born in Cicero, Illinois on December 27, 1943. His father was a machinist for General Electric. When he wasn't at work, he was dedicated to drinking. Indeed, he was a conscientious drunk. His mother, Alberta, was a homemaker. John had 4 siblings: Henry, Donald, Mary, and Joanne. Cicero was close to Chicago, and while John was growing up, the mafia frequently made headlines. Aside from the mob families in New York City, the so-called Chicago outfit was exceedingly wealthy and powerful. The Chicago outfit gangsters certainly enjoyed all the fringe benefits that are available to people who wield that kind of power and influence. John idolized the mafia figures that everyone was talking about and dreamed of being a gangster like Al Capone, save for the sexually transmitted diseases. He told his friends that he had 2 career paths in mind for his adulthood: the mafia or the priesthood. He dreamed of being a tough guy. His parents were greatly relieved when John opted for the priesthood. In 1957, he enrolled in the Quigley Preparatory Seminary for Theology Studies. 1961. John graduated from the seminary at the age of 17. By the time he graduated, he had shifted gears and enrolled in Morton Junior College in Cicero, where he would study to become an X-ray technician. Capricious as always, he dropped out before he could graduate. He conned his way into working at hospitals in the X-ray department. At the hospital where he worked, he met and began dating 21-year-old Nancy Jo Lynch. They married in 1964. John's employment at the hospital was not to last, for he was caught embezzling money from the hospital's coffers. He vowed to pay back the money if they didn't report the theft to the authorities. There were rumors that he was an associate of the mafia and stole the money to submit to their largesse, but it was never proven. It wasn't likely, but John and Nancy fled the Chicago area soon after his transgression came to light. John and Nancy moved to Kansas City, Kansas. He applied for a position at Children's Mercy Hospital. Once again, he lied about his qualifications as an X-ray technician. He also told them he was a medical student on his way to becoming a doctor. Another lie. He told his new employer that he wished to work night shifts so that he could continue with his studies. It wasn't long before John's behavior in the workplace became problematic. He was pushy with patients, and he didn't seem to understand the X-ray equipment as well as a typical professional would. January 1965. John's first child was born. He wasn't home often enough to honor his duties as husband and father, for after work most days he would go out to bars to meet women. Due to his gold-bricking at work and his reputation as a Lothario, he was terminated from his job. April 1966. John was hired by another hospital. Not only did he bullshit his way into getting hired as an X-ray technician, but he was installed as head of the department. To avoid having his incompetence found out, he delegated most of his duties to his subordinates. His daughter Kimberly was born shortly after he was hired. He would bring pictures of her to work to display to his colleagues. Still, he would boast about the less wholesome activities he would pursue at bars. Robinson hadn't learned his lesson from his previous job. That being, he could not embezzle funds from the hospital and get away with it. He forged a doctor's signature to pilfer $100,000 from the hospital's accounts. This time he was reported to the police. He didn't flee. He waited for the police to arrive at the hospital, and they took him away quietly. Robinson was convicted, but only received 3 years probation with a suspended sentence. It was known by the judge that he was the sole breadwinner for a family. Nancy acted as character witness at his hearing. That was the clincher that won clemency for her husband. Robinson found a new job, this time as a systems analyst at Mobil Oil. It was a combination of forged documents and his way with words that got him the position, despite his lack of qualifications. He also managed to somehow bury his criminal record. That aspect of his life and personality was found out, though not through a background check. He was caught stealing hundreds of dollars worth of postage stamps. He and his family moved back to Chicago in 1970 so he could avoid being charged. Robinson embarked on a new career, one that enabled him to put his skills as a silver-tongued devil to practical use: insurance sales. He was caught embezzling once again. He was charged, but avoided prison time by agreeing to pay back the money to his former employer. The state attorney notified officials back in Kansas about what had happened, and his probation was extended. 1971, Nancy gave birth to fraternal twins, a boy and girl. They would have no more children. Nancy was still unaware of the double life her husband was leading, with the almost nightly carousing and promiscuity. Despite being woefully underqualified to do so, John Robinson started a medical consulting firm called Professional Services Association. It was almost a shell company, a front for him to engage in fraudulent activity. He provided about as many services as Bernie Madoff. 1975. Speaking of making off, Robinson's fraudulent activities caught up with him when they were detected by the authorities. He was charged with mail and securities fraud. Despite his lengthy rap sheet, he still managed to avoid prison. At his trial in 1976, he pleaded no contest and was slapped with a fine and probation. 1977, Robinson and his family relocated to Arapahoe, Kansas. He moved into a home on the Pleasant Valley Farms estate. His neighbors remembered him as an exemplary family man. He attended community events and joined a Presbyterian church, whereupon he volunteered for the organization. Soon, Robinson started another business. It was a venture that offered information on how one could start a hydroponic growing operation. He needed investors to help him get the business going. A man named Brooks Rickard forked over $25,000. He never so much as received a nickel in return. More likely, John Robinson pocketed the cash and indulged himself. Robinson was eager to advance his standing in the community. He figured he could accomplish this by creating an award that would be issued to him. It was the Kansas Man of the Year Award, and he advertised the ceremony. It was promoted as being held in City Hall in December 1977. He backed it up with forged documents by people who were purported to have supported his nomination. Apparently, everyone fell for it. A state senator showed up to take full advantage of a photo op with Robinson. The revelry was short-lived. A reporter did enough investigating to find out that the whole thing was contrived, and Robinson was portrayed as a con artist and buffoon. Due to this, nobody else invested in the hydroponic business, and he had to shelve the entire operation. He was left with no choice but to find a regular job. He was hired by potato chip maker Guy's Foods. They apparently hadn't run a criminal background check. His probation period ended at this time, adding another advantage. Robinson was generally well regarded by his colleagues and the management, but he couldn't help himself and began to embezzle funds once he convinced the company they could trust him not to do that. He also began sleeping with the company's secretary. She provided assistance in his embezzlement scheme. He would create phantom employees, people who worked there on paper but did not actually exist. He would draw up paychecks for them and keep the money for himself. Eventually, his secretary, Paramore, used her knowledge of his criminal activity against him, blackmailing him with the information that he could get fired or worse. She notified him that if he didn't leave his wife for her, she would report him to management. He assumed she was bluffing and refused to leave his wife. She followed through on her promise to squeal on him to anybody who would listen. He was fired on December 30th, 1980. John Robinson would end up receiving many new criminal charges. In late 1981, he was found guilty and was mandated to pay restitution to the tune of $50,000. He was permitted to pay it back in installments and would pay $41,000 of his debt over the subsequent years. He was also incarcerated for 60 days. Aware that he was a recidivist con man, the judge decided that such an experience would straighten him out. No such luck. Nancy filed for divorce. It wasn't just because he was running afoul of the law so often. The affair with the secretary was the clincher. It was a source of considerable embarrassment for her family and friends, who had been encouraging her to leave him for years. Metaphorically speaking, his signature on the wedding license was written in his own shit. Remarkably, he was able to talk her out of leaving him. She would claim later that she stayed with him for the children's sake. 1982. Robinson was released from prison early in the year, and he applied the knowledge he acquired in Con College to start up another fraudulent enterprise. It was a financial services company called EquiPlus. He operated in collaboration with a man named Scott Davis. Davis was seeking investors for a computer company he started called Online Computers. Scott was to give Robinson 30% of all profits. Ultimately, this fell through when the investor John pulled on board reneged on his agreement. It has been suspected that most of the investors were involved with or connected to the mafia. This led to Scott Davis pulling out of the deal with Robinson. Robinson was outraged that Davis would withdraw his participation. He vowed that there would be consequences for not paying him. Robinson even drafted a false contract that included a clause that stated that Davis was to compensate him no matter what happened. Scott didn't fall for it, and he refused to pay. They exchanged threats until Robinson resigned himself to the fact that he wasn't going to get any money out of Davis. Robinson's neighbors were now aware that he was a career criminal, and his image as a wholesome and upstanding, law-abiding family man was tainted. It certainly didn't help when he approached a neighbor about their barking dog, threatening to beat them up if they didn't put the animal on mute. John's son was riding his bicycle when the dog ran out in front of him, and to avoid the dog, his son swerved and fell onto the sidewalk. His goal to become a member of the board of the Homeowners Association was not likely to pan out at this point. Later that year, Robinson reconnected with an ex-con and fellow inmate named Irv Blattner. The two of them would become partners in crime. Blattner had other, more marketable skills, however. He was adept at video and audio production. This gave Robinson an idea. Equi Plus would be refashioned into a movie production studio. Robinson was to seek investors from Hollywood. He presented himself as a freelance movie mogul who raised money for such projects as First Blood. He didn't elicit much interest in this scheme. However, a man named Ted Findley invested $10,000 in the business. Naturally, it was nothing but a loss for him. After attempting to contact Robinson for 6 months and getting no reply, John finally called him back and told him the company was bankrupt. Shortly thereafter, he started a company called Equi 2. John Robinson's career in the bunco business was ceaseless, as always. He met a woman who was desperate to be divorced from a Nigerian national, decades before the emergence of the Nigerian prince emails. She was promised that he would take care of the divorce for her. When she discovered months later that the divorce had never been filed, she was shocked. On the warpath, she confronted Robinson and vowed to report him to the authorities. Realizing he would do even more time than before, he returned the $200 she paid him. His days of ripping people off were far from over, however. He had placed an ad in the newspaper indicating that he was seeking a sales representative. Paula Godfrey was a recent high school graduate, and she applied for the position. He was quite taken with her, so much so that he hired her immediately. He told her that part of her orientation and training would include flying to San Antonio, Texas, to take a course in clerical skills. On the occasion when he picked her up under the guise of driving her to the airport, he took a detour, and she was never seen again. Paul's father was determined to find her. He even went as far as to go to San Antonio to track her down, which included going to the hotel she told him she would be staying at. He wasn't prepared to stop at that and filed a missing persons report. Determined to approach it from every angle, he even hired a private investigator. Willing to try anything at that point, he approached Robinson directly to ask him if he happened to know anything regarding his daughter's whereabouts. Reportedly, John presented as bewildered when her disappearance was brought to his attention and came across as innocent. Mr. Godfrey may not have had any evidence that Robinson was responsible for his daughter going missing, but he was vaguely threatening when making it known to him that he had better be contacted by his daughter at some point. Though Godfrey was no detective, his instincts in assuming that the parties who saw his daughter in the final hours before her absence might possess some important information about her final destination were correct. It just so happens that a letter arrived at Godfrey's home 2 days later. Interesting timing. In the letter, she said she was fine. Godfrey didn't buy this for a second. He took it to the police station to have it added to the file. Another letter was received, this time by the police. In that letter, Paula said she was safe and sound and that she did not want to be contacted by her family. Making it appear that she was angry with her parents was his approach to making it seem as though she would never return. He must never have gotten to know her well, for he didn't know whether or not she was willing to go as far as moving to San Antonio to be away from them. It's the kind of thing a person might do if they joined a cult, but such a thing as being seduced by a cult leader took time, and she was not the kind of person to be taken in by such a thing. Cults forbid their members from contacting their families because their families can talk some sense into them. Clearly, she had a loving and caring family who were willing to go to the ends of the earth to find her. She had no reason to cut her ties. Though Godfrey wasn't convinced that his daughter was committing metaphysical patricide, the police were willing to accept that as an explanation for why she disappeared, and the case was closed. They pointed out that there was no evidence of wrongdoing. Justifiably frustrated that the Donut Squad had thrown in the towel, all he could do was pursue the investigation on his own, with any resources he could gather. It would be like reading a book from the conclusion backwards, only all the pages are blank, and he would have to tell the story all the way to the beginning, where the perpetrator's identity and their methods would be revealed. Without any assistance from the pros, it would prove to be daunting. However, he was a father who loved his daughter more than anything in the world, and because of this, he was not prepared to give up. John and Irv Blattner were not getting along. In fact, they had fallen out entirely. Irv was worried that John might kill him. This fear was likely based on his suspicion that Robinson murdered Paula Godfrey. Lending some credence to this theory was the letter he found in Robinson's office, which was written and forged as a missive from Paula. He pocketed the letter, feeling he could use it as insurance in case Robinson tried to move against him in some way. It was found among his belongings after he perished from cancer years later. It wasn't long after Paula's disappearance that Robinson leased a duplex in the indigent section of town. It was not a home, it was to be a brothel, and he was about to embark on a career as a pimp. He was doing well enough financially to pay the rent every month, and it would become a place where he could indulge in some of his more unorthodox sexual proclivities. Speaking of which, he was greatly interested in BDSM, or bondage, discipline, sadism, masochism. He did not want to remain a spectator. Furthermore, he didn't want to be a recipient. He wanted to be dominant, and there were few limits in terms of how far he was willing to go to flesh out the scenarios he envisioned within that framework. He was serious about this, so much so he joined a sex cult called the International Council of Masters. Robinson would use a space in the duplex to act on some of these fantasies. To quote Kansas City-based journalist Kevin Petrom, Robinson was the cult's slavemaster, and it was a position he excelled at. His job was to bring a victim to meetings for either beatings, torture, or rape. Reportedly, whenever Robinson frequented internet chat rooms years later, he would use the handle slavemaster. He deliberately recruited prostitutes who were willing to play the role of submissive for their tricks. Special arrangements existed beyond the realm of so-called vanilla missionary position sex, typically pay better, so the girls in his employ did not object. At some point in the mid-1980s, John Robinson, posing as a representative of the First Presbyterian Church of Stanley, contacted a home for young mothers called Birthright. He told the staff he owned a duplex where the girls could live rent-free until they got their lives together. It was too good to be true. He was actually looking for young women to mold into call girls. He succeeded in getting a meeting with a woman named Barbara Bergman, who managed the operation. But when she informed him that many of the girls were drug addicts, he changed his mind. Any experienced pimp knows that drug addicts make the best prostitutes, since you can keep them tethered to you as long as you supply them their poison of choice. Strange that a man who so badly wanted to dominate women would pass on this opportunity. Considering that he was suddenly so quick to change his mind about the whole thing, Bergman became very suspicious about John Robinson. She called up the church he claimed to be representing. A church official told her he was a member but did not represent them in any manner relating to an outreach program benefiting young mothers. Eventually, she reported the incident, and Robinson's probation officer was notified. He was not fond of John Robinson by any means. He considered him to be a sleazeball and would denigrate him on the basis of his weight, calling him Pillsbury Doughboy. It would come to light years later that not only did Robinson wish to groom a young mother into becoming a prostitute, but he would sell her baby to his brother. He hatched this scheme when his brother Donald told him he and his wife wished to adopt a baby. They were beset in their efforts to conceive a child as nature intended due to fertility issues. John told them he could get a baby for them without as much as breaking a sweat. He said he would arrange the transaction through his business contacts, and it would be above board. It's surprising that they would believe this, taking his lengthy history as a con artist into consideration. However, though he was usually given to making empty promises that only paid off for himself, he did know a young and unattached mother named Lisa Stassi. She was 19 years old and staying at a women's shelter along with her baby in the aftermath of a defunct marriage. A social worker told her about a local philanthropist who used his own funds to put up women in her kind of position. Indeed, he vowed to sponsor her as she set about getting her GED. Furthermore, she wanted to take some courses at a post-secondary school so she could train for a career. She immediately seized upon this opportunity. In January 1985, Robinson collected Lisa and her child. She didn't get to live in the duplex. He deposited her at a Fleabag motel called the Roadway Inn. He told her that she would only be living there temporarily and that he was making arrangements for her and her child to live in Chicago. He sealed the deal by having her sign 3 blank sheets of paper. She was too green to intuit that there was something dodgy about this manner of doing business. In truth, he was about to make copies of her signature so that he could forge documents in her name. She didn't know there was potential for her credit and status as a non-offender to be put at risk of being severely blemished. In the process, he asked her for a list of her relatives' addresses. His plan was to send them forged letters, whose text would claim to have been written by Lisa. Despite her youth and inexperience, Lisa could tell this was a shady operation, and she moved in with her ex-husband's sister, Kathy. Somehow he figured out where she was staying, and he demanded she return to him. Kathy remembered him as being highly agitated. He convinced Lisa to return with him. Lisa would go on to regret not taking action to prevent this from happening. She feared for Lisa's safety at the time. To quote Kathy from his trial, "I was afraid of him. I knew deep down that was the last time I would see Lisa." Lisa's baby, Tiffany, was delivered to Donald's door. Conveniently for John, the details of how she came to be in Donald's custody were omitted. The story he was given was that the mother committed suicide in a hotel. It was indeed true that Lisa was dead by that point, but not by her own hand. John Robinson's probation officer, Steve Himes, noticed that Lisa Stassi and Paula Godfrey went missing after encounters with Robinson, and he became suspicious. He had heard that Paula Godfrey wrote letters after running away. It seemed like the kind of forgery scheme devised by John Robinson. He figured that Robinson, more than anybody else, had to be responsible for her disappearance. Though it still wasn't confirmed whether she was living or dead, unlike the police, he was determined to ascertain what her then current status was. As far as the disappearance of Lisa Stassi and Tiffany, he was even more alarmed since a baby was missing. He reported this to the FBI. However, they were slow to act, so very little action was taken. Meanwhile, John Robinson's first arrest of 1985 on March 21st came when his old business partner, Irv Blattner, squealed on him to the authorities because of his check-cashing scheme. There were already suspicions within law enforcement circles that Robinson was circulating bad checks. Blattner was concerned that if it was found out, he would be dragged down through the muck with Robinson and even take the hit entirely. Blattner agreed to testify against Robinson in exchange for immunity. Robinson was arrested soon after he reported to Hames. Robinson was released on $50,000 bail. He denied having been involved in fraudulent activities, including leading Mildred Amati to believe he could act as her divorce lawyer. He insisted Blattner was responsible for it all. He faced another parole-related charge in connection with Blattner. He was not to associate with known felons. He denied having known Blattner was a convicted felon, and incredibly, he did not do any time. April 1985. John Robinson met a young woman named Teresa Williams at McDonald's. She was struggling financially, despite working 2 jobs, one at a Kmart and the other at a laundromat. He proposed a solution to the problem. After undressing her with his eyes from head to toe, he suggested that with a figure like hers, she could make a handsome living. Teresa took him up on his offer and was soon staying at one of his properties, where she was being groomed to become a sex worker. She represented one of his most profitable exploitations yet, often drawing in thousands of dollars over the course of a single evening. On one occasion, a rich man paid her to visit his BDSM dungeon so he could torture her. However, the medieval device he used proved to be too much for her, and she demanded to go home. This enraged Robinson. He was frequently abusive with her physically. It was not the first time. She recalled an incident when she awoke to find him pulling on her hair. He flipped her over and began to spank her. He said, "You've been a real bad girl. You need to learn a lesson." He vowed that if she did not cooperate, he would, quote, "blow your brains out." He put his gun to her temple and squeezed the trigger. She assumed she was about to die, but when he pulled the trigger, all that she heard was click. It was psychological torture. She decided to let him have his way to spare herself any further abuse. He put the gun to her stomach and dragged it along all the way down between her legs. He inserted the barrel of the gun into her vagina. He pushed it in and out repetitively in a fashion reminiscent of rape. Well, it was rape. Despite her experience in being the submissive party in BDSM activities, she was petrified. After he was finished with this, he told her to write about the experience in her diary and to note that she feared for her life. She was also to mention that if anything especially egregious were to happen to her, i.e. murder, Irv Blattner was to blame. The FBI were on to John Robinson. One way while Teresa Williams was at a laundromat, she was accosted by two agents. They asked her some questions regarding her association with John Robinson. She told them he was going to take her to the Bahamas. The agents immediately knew she was in grave danger. They placed her in protective custody and installed her in a safe house. They proceeded further with their investigation of Robinson. John Robinson was infuriated when he returned to his brothel after watching his son's soccer game and found that Teresa Williams was absent. He took to the streets but could not find her, even if he had tracked her down. She already told the FBI everything that could put him in sodomy school for a very long time. However, his latest criminal charges were not related to human trafficking. He was falsifying business records for a company called Back Care Systems. He manipulated the data on the invoices, thereby redirecting money to himself. At one point, he had embezzled $3,600. He was found guilty in January 1986. Around that time, a young woman named Catherine Clampett went missing. She was born in Korea, but was adopted by an American family who raised her in Texas. She met John Robinson at the age of 27 in Wichita Falls, Texas. She contacted him in response to an ad he placed in a newspaper about his shell company. The implication was that she would do some clerical work or even be the company's secretary. She was happy when he informed her that her position could involve some travel. Instead, she only found herself within the confines of John Robinson's nefarious domain. "1993. Robinson was released from prison on parole. He was 49 years old. The world had changed considerably during his incarceration, especially on the technological front. Cellular phones were on the ascent as a communications medium, even if it would be about 5 years before they would become more affordable. Most importantly, there was a new communications medium that was rapidly rising in popularity. And with email and websites, it offered up many possibilities for the so-called global village to congregate and share aspects of their lives. Unfortunately, the internet also has a dark side, and it would become a haven for con artists, arms dealers, child pornographers, and human traffickers to do their business outside the purview of the authorities. Even to this day, It is challenging for investigators to track down the worst of the offenders. Enter John Robinson. He was not experienced with the internet at the time, but he was computer literate. He was awarded a position as an office worker in prison, the official name of the role being office coordinator for the jail's maintenance operation. He is an evil piece of shit, but he was no dummy. Not only was he computer literate, but he had even learned how to write software. Otherwise, his time on the inside was largely uneventful, save for suffering strokes. Evidently, he didn't suffer enough. Before he was released, he had been working in the prison's library. While there, he became closely acquainted with the chief librarian, Beverly Bonner. She was married to the prison's doctor. She was bored and dissatisfied with both her marriage and her job. She was looking for some excitement, some color for her monochrome life. Robinson talked a lot of shit, but from her vantage point, the stench was undetectable. So she fell for it when he sold her on an idea he had for growing organic vegetables hydroponically. They agreed to remain in touch following his release. Oh, by the way, he was still married, too. Nancy was faithfully waiting. She welcomed him back home when he was released. By then, she had sold their house due to financial difficulties and moved to a trailer park in Belton, Missouri. Dr. Bonner discovered that his wife had been unfaithful and the divorce was well underway. Beverly moved out of their house in 1994. She was looking forward to starting afresh with her exciting life, led by John Robinson. He had relocated to Kansas City to start up Hydro Grow, the hydroponic operation. Robinson's status as an ex-con and extensive history as a fraudster was not exactly an asset to a man starting up his own business. This is where Beverly became his ace in the hole. She had no criminal record and was considered a good credit risk. He appointed her president of the company and would enter her name in official business documents and correspondence. Eventually, Beverly's utility as a resource for Robinson's business expired. Now that he couldn't use her as he once had, he rented a storage unit off Highway 58 in rural Raymore, Missouri. It was in that storage unit where he deposited a sealed barrel one day. It contained the remains of Beverly Bonner. He killed her via blunt force trauma. If a woman couldn't make money for him, he just wanted her dead. Nancy was the lucky one, I guess. She held down the fort at home and took care of the kids, so she was still useful to him. The injuries that were visited upon his victims to ensure their untimely and undeserved demise were reverse engineered by experts in the field. The most common theory was that he had killed them with a hammer. He finished her off by forging several letters on her behalf and sending them to her friends and family to deflect suspicions from himself. According to the letters, she just had to get away from it all. If only it had occurred to her to do so before she was killed. John Robinson bought 2 desktop computers shortly after he was released from prison. He soon discovered online chat rooms. Remember days of ASL? If you're a Gen Zer, that acronym stands for age, sex, location, since most people, or at least most men, view chat rooms as virtual singles bars. As previously mentioned, John Robinson's username was slavemaster. He was on the prowl for victims and used the same sales tactics he employed back when he was a con man. It was in 1994 that he met a woman named Sheila Dale Faith online. She grew up as part of a dysfunctional family and wound up as a troubled adult, as many such people do. Perhaps as a means to compensate for the stability and normalcy that so eluded her as a child, she married young in 1993. She had a daughter named Debbie, who had cerebral palsy and was confined to a wheelchair. Adding to her sorrows was the death of her husband, John, the last good John of her life, as it turned out. At that juncture, she was at a low point. It's during times like that when a person is susceptible to a kind and sympathetic gesture and a helping hand. In the absence of that, all she had was a stipend she received from the government that barely kept her and Debbie afloat. Sheila spent much of her time in internet chat rooms. It was in that septic tank of human sludge that she met the acquaintance of John Robinson. There he was in his own canoe with an extra paddle. It would make sense that she would form a bond with John Robinson. She was intrigued by the darker side of the sexual spectrum. She even hung erotic pictures in her bedroom. She cared not if her daughter, still a minor, might roll past in her wheelchair and see them. She would always find some way to get her daughter out of the house whenever she hosted for one-night stands. Her daughter likely saw those pictures of naked men with big dicks almost daily. But exposing her to casual sex, even if she only got the audio feed, that would be taking it too far, of course. Her daughter, Debbie, was all too happy to get out of the house whenever her mother had one of her, quote, friends over. She was creeped out by those guys, especially the ones who behaved suggestively toward her. Sheila and John Robinson bonded over their passion for BDSM. They would discuss it at length over the phone when no one was using the dial-up internet. It was the early 90s, after all. And apparently there were no awkward silences. Both were all in. There was only one problem: geography. She lived in California while he still resided in Kansas City. It was an obstacle, but not an insurmountable one, at least not in his view. He offered to drive all the way there himself and bring her back. It's not like she had much to lose. She was unemployed with very little to hang on for. She was divorced and lonely. BDSM and John Robinson would fill in the blanks of her life quite nicely, and she took him up on the offer. Summer 1994. Though he was usually a liar and con artist, this was an occasion wherein Sheila Faith found John Robinson to be a man of his word. He showed up at her home in California in a van and loaded hers and Debbie's belongings into it before their long trek to Kansas City. Hence began their departure to the gates of death. When Robinson was arrested later, the putrefacted remains of Sheila and Debbie would be found in sealed barrels, like the others. He set up a P.O. box for Sheila to receive mail after moving out of California. He used her Social Security checks to put money on a new house in Big Key, Florida, for his son, though John Sr. remained in Kansas City. Meanwhile, Nancy was hired to become the manager of the trailer park they lived in. He spent much of the money he made from fraud on home improvements. If Trailer Park Boys has taught me anything, it's that the manager or supervisor lives rent-free in the park. So if that was true for the Robinsons, they surely stood to prosper. 1995. While Nancy held down the double-wide fort, Ron was trolling internet chat rooms looking for his next victim. In doing so, he met a woman who identified herself by the handle Chloe Elizabeth. Chloe was part of the minority that crossed paths with Robinson and lived to tell the story. She described herself to him as 30 years old and deeply involved in the BDSM lifestyle. He sold himself as a successful entrepreneur, which impressed her. Online, it can be nearly impossible to get an accurate portrait of someone, especially in a 1995-era chat room. In that circumstance, one is unable, to borrow a phrase from the movie Hardcore Logo, to know shit from good chocolate. He told her he was once voted Kansas City's Man of the Year, while neglecting to mention that it was a dubious honorific erected upon a foundation of mendacity. Chloe lived much closer to John's neck of the woods. She lived in Topeka, Kansas. At one point, she invited him to her home. The agenda was kinky sex from the get-go. She answered the door in a transparent robe, a thong, and high heels. He turned up in a navy blue business suit. He wasn't vanilla in the bedroom, but outside of closed doors, that's how he came across. He even had a briefcase with him, though instead of just documents, it also contained a dog collar and a chain. He wasted no time. He put the dog collar around her neck and attached the chain as a leash. She led them to her bedroom in back, where their sexual encounter began. There she removed her clothes and allowed Robinson to tie her up and whip her with his belt. From there, he, quote, trained her breasts. This is BDSM parlance for tying small ropes around a woman's breasts tightly until they swell up and become tender to the touch. Only after her breasts turned red like ripened tomatoes did he remove them. Having put the ropes back where he had gotten them, he commanded her to perform fellatio on him. Once they were finished with all that business, he took a document out of his briefcase. It was called a slave contract, and he insisted that she sign it. Within this context of his criminal history, one could reasonably say that by doing so, a woman was literally signing her life away. But fortunately, that did not come to pass with Chloe Elizabeth. The contract stated that he had control over her at any time he wanted. She stated that he was a perfect gentleman beyond the parameters of BDSM activity. She had nothing but accolades for him when describing their premier encounter. As she put it, that was the first date. It was sensational. He had an ability to command, to control, to corral someone as strong and aggressive and spirited as I am. And that glowing review was given after she found out about all the murders. She mentioned that after they had met several times, he asked her to sign several pieces of blank paper and to give him the names and addresses of her friends and relatives. This she would not do. Their encounters soon dwindled to nothing. 1997. John Robinson started yet another company. This one was called Specialty Publications of America. One such publication was called Manufactured Modular Living. Simply put, it was a magazine about trailer park living, both for the experienced and the uninitiated. The problem was, he was the writer for the publication, and his knowledge was considerably limited in comparison to that of his wife. For many, it was a case of the blind leading the blind, while those who could see were unable to ignore his incompetence. Much of what he wrote was pure fiction, and for those first-timers taking it as gospel, it would prove problematic down the road when their assumptions, which they assumed were informed, were not. Meanwhile, John Robinson continued to build a following online as the slave master, and he would meet more women who would sign his slave contracts. Of course, these contracts were not legally binding. They weren't the kind of indentures you would take to a notary public. Still, Robinson would establish in the minds of himself and his sub that they were bound for as long as he wanted. Another of the survivors gave him access to her individual retirement account, though she would eventually sue her way out of the entanglement. A young woman named Izabela Lewiska, who was a Polish immigrant and attending university, met Robinson in 1997. They met in a chat room. She was depressed due to feelings of loneliness. She was still in the process of becoming fluent in English, and being a Polish national put her in a socially barren situation in college, where it seemed like everybody was drowning in friendship and love. It was during this time of vulnerability that she began chatting with strange men online. It was true that she was in danger of meeting either creeps with designs on harming her, or, to borrow a line from the kids in the hall, Trekkies with red pubic hair. John Robinson was obviously more in keeping with the former, though he would not present himself as such when they first met. In fact, she was so delighted by the impression he made upon her that she dropped out of university and headed to Kansas City to major in John Robinson 101. She told her parents she was going there to serve an internship. Apparently, Robinson was surprised by Isabella's willingness to submit to his agenda. Normally, he had to work on a woman, seducing her mind before making his way down her body. He was also surprised by her clothing, which was black and trademarked as in keeping with the goth subculture. It was hardly unusual considering that her sexual proclivities were so similar to his. He was not pleased by her wardrobe. What did he expect, a June Cleaver look-alike? He told her it would be for the best if she went back home. She wasn't going to take this lying down. Well, she would eventually. She sacrificed everything for her new life with Robinson, and she begged him to let her stay. She was the perfect sub. He finally consented to allow her to become a fixture in his life, though she did not live with him and Nancy at the trailer park, of course. She got her own apartment in Kansas City. She got what she wanted, for she and Robinson were seldom apart when he wasn't at home with Nancy. If anybody recognized him on the street with her, he would tell the person she was the daughter of a business associate. Many people didn't buy it, for it appeared that John Robinson was much more than a mentor to Isabella. In fact, the two were very much a couple for a while, and even went as far as to apply for a marriage license, though it was never finalized. At some point, Isabella disappeared. When people asked him what happened to her, he would say she was deported. He would tell them she was wrapped up in the world of narcotics trafficking, and he was concerned he would get dragged down into it with her. It wasn't entirely untrue. She was deported into the afterlife with a hammer to her head, after which her remains were stuffed into a barrel and sealed over. Robinson sold the house he owned in the Florida Keys and bought some land in rural Kansas near the township of La Cine. It included a barn and a pond. Robinson would go on to refer to this as his farm. He had a trailer delivered to the property and used it as his living quarters. He would erect fencing around his domicile, which caused him to run into disputes with his neighbors over where their boundaries began and ended. Robinson began hosting BDSM sessions at his new trailer. He met them online in chat rooms, and many of the BDSM types were very keen on meeting the slavemaster. Enter 28-year-old Suzette Troughton. She was eager to become his slave and engaged in marathon conversations with Robinson throughout the Christmas holidays of 1999 about the BDSM lifestyle. He invited her to pay him a visit at his farm in spring. February 14th, 2000. Troughton was unable to wait any longer and arrived at Robinson's property so she could meet and submit to her master. She initially stayed in a hotel whose bill was paid by Robinson. As they indulged in their BDSM-related pursuits, Robinson also promised to hire her to work as an assistant. He sweetened the deal by promising that the role would have her traveling the world. He included Australia as a destination. Everything changed when he invited her to his country estate. Can you call a trailer an estate? I suppose you're limited only by your imagination. He took her there in March 2000, and she would never be seen alive again. After killing Suzette and disposing of her remains, he went online and impersonated her and interacted with her friends. It was by doing this that he met her friend Crystal. It turned out that Crystal was attracted to the same BDSM undertakings as Suzette. Posing as Suzette, he told her of a dom named James Turner. From there, they chatted frequently, exchanged photos, and, in keeping with his role as dom, Robinson gave her explicit instructions on what she should do as his slave on a virtual basis. Crystal would not take it to the next level, that being offline contact, but she remained in contact with this man as she wondered if, by doing so, she would find out what happened to Suzette. Meanwhile, Robinson began sending emails to her friends and relatives, claiming to be her so that they would be reassured. They didn't believe it, so he withdrew. He took the tack of calling her mother and telling her that Suzette ran off with some man and had stolen his credit card. Robinson played the victim card for all it was worth. He insisted that her mother contact him if she ever heard from Suzette. March 2000. The police had been investigating John Robinson in connection with the deaths of the young women, and they were narrowing in on him. There were several leads that didn't yield many results, but then they were contacted by a woman named Melissa Wright, and that changed everything. Wright told police she had been an associate of Robinson's, and she had been threatened by him. She filled them in on the BDSM scenarios in which they had engaged. She said that there was a tipping point at which she nearly wound up becoming the latest woman to occupy a sealed barrel. By that time, police had been in contact with Crystal, and she forwarded to them all the emails she exchanged with Robinson. Much of what he wrote was purely deceptive, but there was indications of the diabolical agenda he had in store for her. This did not mark the end of Crystal's involvement in the investigation of John Robinson, only the end of her cooperation with local police. The FBI were using her as bait to entrap Robinson. The idea was that she would visit the farm and they would swoop down at the right moment. She kept delaying the visit, stringing Robinson along. He waited begrudgingly, but was left with no alternative. Investigative efforts accelerated when two women pressed charges against John Robinson, Melissa Wright and Virginia Dixon. Wright charged him with unwanted assault during a session of BDSM. Dixon's complaint was that he had stolen her sex toys. As far as crimes go, they were hardly in the same league as murder, but they did endow the investigating officers with the power to obtain an arrest warrant. June 2nd, 2000. John Robinson woke up that morning unaware that a fleet of unmarked police cars had pulled up on his property to serve him a breakfast of bread and water. After hearing a knock, he went to the door and was informed he was under arrest. For once in a long time, he was this sub, cooperating with the arresting officers, as he was taken into custody without incident. His property was searched. A plastic box containing Isabella Lewinsky's belongings was found. However, he was not charged with murder at that time. He was taken to jail for the assault on Melissa Wright. Nancy Robinson was brought into the police station for questioning. She claimed to have been ignorant of his secret life as a BDSM dom. She said she only suspected him of having an affair. She would later do her utmost to establish an alibi for John, like when she said he was babysitting their grandchildren when he was purported to have killed Suzette Troughton. Cadaver-sniffing dogs were brought to the Robinson Farm barn to detect any notable evidence. It wasn't long before they began to bark loudly and incessantly at two sealed barrels. The police opened the barrels and found the decomposing corpses of two women. They had been rotting for so long that it was likely that the coroner would find some data impossible to ascertain, like the approximate date of death. They were photographed and sent off to a forensic lab for an autopsy. A storage unit John Robinson rented at a facility called Store More for Less contained 3 more sealed barrels, all of which held the decomposing remains of young women. All of the above led to a great deal of media coverage. Amid all the headlines were the christening of John Robinson as the first, quote, cybersex serial killer, end quote. One could rightly say he was a pioneer in that regard. Couldn't he have pioneered something that would serve humanity better, like the cure for cancer or time travel? No, he's not that clever. June 13th, John Robinson was charged with 5 counts of murder. The bodies of Lisa Stassi, Paula Godfrey, and Catherine Clampett were never found, but were presumed to be dead. Fall 2002. John Robinson was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to death. He was transferred to El Dorado Correctional Facility, where death row awaited him. He remains there to this day. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.